So for this piece, I thought I would create an improvisatory description or telling of a scene of a place that of a moment, that I've referred to often, but haven't described in any detail. And and I thought, that I would begin, that description, and I'll keep in abeyance for a bit what that will be a description of. But I thought I would begin with this famous poem of Robert Duncan's, Often I Am Permitted to Return to a Meadow, and and all the implications of what that meadow means in terms of poetry as field. And it's reference to field painting, but it's reference to the way, I suppose, that that Duncan develops out of Olson's projective verse, this idea of poetry as field, and not just the page as something that can be organized in terms of passages that are made in perhaps in a way that's reminiscent of the notion of sauntering, that that Thoreau discusses in his famous essay Walking, in which he imagines this traverse of a kind of ramble, I suppose, of the flaneur who doesn't have any particular destiny, and the idea of speech and writing and even thought as in many ways an unmotivated passage. And of course Duncan is famous for this series of passages, right? We can take that idea of passage in a number of different ways, but of course, a passage as it exists in a text is, say, defined by the space or duration, that composes a segment, but also this notion of passage as passing, and that perhaps also suggests a relationship to the famous idiomatic expression, rite of passage, that in passage that one is passing through or beyond a certain segmented period into the next, right? And then that passage presumably will be replaced by the passage into another domain. And but one doesn't really get a sense in Duncan that these passages are segmented that way. And this poem certainly problematizes that notion of linear stages, right? Again, and because it's a return, and then what it's a return to, is problematized as well in a number of different ways by the instability that that metaphor, right, creates in the naming of anything in particular. So this first preposition, right, as if, and so always already, it isn't, right, but the verb were, it was as if something was to be, right, or were to have been, and yet it is only as if, and then this scene that we enter as if we were returning is once again problematized by by this expression, made up. And of course, what's making it up? And it's very, Kwanzaa-like in this way, made up by the mind, right? So this field that we enter, as if it were a scene made up by the mind. But what would it be if it were to be as if made up by the mind? That suggests something real, right? Because if it's not made up by the mind, but merely as if, perhaps we're entering some real domain, but that feels like it was made up by the mind. But then this mind, right, or something, but the karma confuses us even more. By the mind that is not mine. So is it then that it is made up by Duncan's mind, but merely appears to be, as if, right, as if that mind that made it up was not my own, but is a made place, and then the weird comma again, that is mine. Okay, so seeming to attempt, a kind of clarity that it's as if it were a scene made up by the mind, right, which suggests in general, and that generality perhaps, or maybe, maybe if not read that way, something less than general that is not mine, maybe a different specific mind, but that definite article gives us trouble because it seems to imply a generalized mind, but is a made place, indefinite article, an example, right, of made places. And these made places, there must be more than one of them, or a definite article could have been chosen. That is mine. I make these made places with my mind, or perhaps, the mind element, which is not specified in this phrase, that is mine, having been abandoned. What is mine is perhaps belongs elsewhere. Maybe this made place is mine because it belongs to an experience, and maybe that experience was reality, so that even if it's made by my mind but appears to be made by a mind, the generalized mind, belongs to me as an experience, not a generalized one. Perhaps, or perhaps not, part of memory. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture folded in all thought. And that's interesting, a reference to, pastoral poetry, but pastoral poetry is the opposite of the eternal, right? We have references to eternal in mystic thinkers, like perhaps, Emily Dickinson or William Blake. But pastoral poetry is about the transitory, the seasons that change, the love that may not be realized, the course of thoughts realized and unrealized in the space of a moment in this environment in which change is at the core. An eternal pasture folded. Now that's an interesting verb there. Folded in all thought. And how does that verb folded relate to this idea of the eternal pasture, as if this eternal pasture were something that could be folded either either something flat like a piece of paper or a note that's folded into everything that one thinks, or perhaps folded as I don't know if Robert Duncan was a cook, but if you're creating baked good, you often fold an ingredient as you mix into the mix that you have so far, right? You fold into that very carefully and stir. So that's potentially an option as well. And thinking about my own experience with meadows and being outside, I think I can fairly safely say this, and I think the evidence on my YouTube channel can fairly easily provide support for the claim. I imagine that I personally have spent much more time in actual meadows than Robert Duncan, could possibly have, and that's interesting to me somehow. That this idealized meadow or field was always literary in Duncan to begin with, always a reference to either the pastoral or the romantic setting provided in the space of literature, folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein. And again, somehow this pasture, as it was folded into thought, whether that was with the fingers or with the stirring or something else that I'm neglecting that is possible as a fold. And fold for me would be like a wrinkle in time or a fold in space-time, but I don't believe that really belongs to Duncan. In relationship to pastoral, it almost seems to have a pun, and we could take the fold of sheep, right? And that's interesting. But how do we get from that fold to the hall? That's even a more difficult move, it seems to me. That is a made place created by light, where from the shadows that are forms fall. Where from the shadows that our forms fall. Now that's an interesting syntax that gives me difficulty in interpretation. That is a made place, I understand. Created by light is interesting, because light is in fact what reveals to the eye, but I get the sense that he's talking about light as understanding and clarity more than he is about the actual phenomena of the visualizing of form, where from the shadows that our forms fall. Now, the only thing that I can do with this in terms of the syntax is, imagine that it's this light where from the shadows, so the light creates the shadows, and those shadows, right? The shadows that are forms, created by light, where from the shadows that are forms fall. The only literary reference that I make here is to Plato, and that's obvious, right? So where from the shadows that our forms fall is in some way a refutation, right, of this Platonic idea. Because for Plato, the cavern of shadows does not belong to the domain of forms at all, right? And what would it mean? Okay, so shadows fall from the light, right? But here making them forms, and then the alliteration in this, it seems to drive it on. And again, I the sense that I have of the paradox in the image is Quonset like, right? Is it light dreaming itself shadow in form, or form dreaming itself light in shadow fall? And the syntax, also helps create the confusion. Where from fall, again, a fall and a fall. Now, interesting, fall all architectures I am. Where from fall all architectures I am. So it's interesting that it's not, what gives rise to, but what falls from. And things fall from above, right? Or fall over. Shadows fall in a different way, but fall from, right? In the same way that these architectures that the speaker is claiming he is fall from something. Where from? Now the where from, is it light again, created by light? Light where from fall architectures I am? I mean, perhaps. And where from fall are all architectures I am, I say are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flame lit to the lady. And again, that's interesting in the syntax, because it makes it a bit difficult to traverse. And likenesses, again, is a thing that is not exactly what is, but is what is akin to that, or an image, right? And that suggests, this Platonic idea again. I say, though, I am, I say. So a distinction between being and verbalizing. I say are, but does that make them be? I say they are likenesses of the First Lady, of the First Beloved, whose flowers are not the First Lady, but the First Beloved, whose flowers are flames lit to the Lady. And then more literary references. She it is queen under the hill, whose hosts, more alliteration, are a disturbance of words within words, that is, of field folded. And again, the verb folded. And we see the alliterative motivation here that we did not see when it was merely a pasture. So the interesting thing here is perhaps there was a kind of pun-like motivation in pasture that's been replaced by an alliterative motivation when we reach the field. And that alliterative motivation actually begins in this line. I say are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flames. And then again, another alliterative motivation, lit to the lady. She is queen under the hill. And then hill and hosts are a disturbance of words within words, that is, a field folded. And by the time we get to a field folded, we can really understand that there's at least as much play going on with sound in this particular poem, and the folding of different forms, right, of alliteration and other kinds of acoustic motivation, as there is motivation by semantic interest. It is only a dream of the grass blowing, which is interesting because it could have been growing, right? Given the motivational trajectory of these repetitions in sound. East against the source of the sun. So something, pushing in a way, perhaps against the light, or returning, right? The inspiration. Okay, so if inspiration comes from light and the idea of a sunrise, then the grass is breathing back, right? Against, or in return, perhaps blowing east against the source of the sun, and perhaps source of inspiration, in an hour before the sun's going down. So again, we have a reference to transience and the pastoral, even though originally it was described as eternal. But if we imagine it as a return, and it happens every day, it's eternal in a certain sense, whose secret we see in a child's game of ring around of roses told. And the told again gives us a bit of trouble, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring around of roses told. And perhaps the secret is what the game means symbolically, maybe not, and perhaps the telling or the told is the revelation of that understanding, or perhaps not. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were, and this is a repetition of, if not verbatim, of the ideas of the first stanza, as if it were a given property of the mind that certain bounds hold against chaos, that is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. And in reading this piece, I'm struck by having read Duncan early in my I don't know what we would call it, experience of contemporary poetry. I'm struck by what a different kind of poet Robert Duncan was from the poet that I have become or have been over many years, and what an extraordinarily in a certain way traditional lyric poet Duncan was, and is and can be seen here, and how the work plays with a number of different traditions. And it seems to me there's the tradition of there's the romantic tradition that it plays out, but more important than that is this idea of poetic conceits. And I had never really thought about Duncan as a metaphysical poet, but it's very, very difficult not to see the metaphysical poetics in this particular text, right? And the way that it moves, like with this kind of like elegance and grace, through these sets of almost what are poised as principles of like these philosophical principles of various sets of thematic concerns, like the difference between something that is made and that something that exists in nature. The difference between something that is one's own and that something that can be generalized as a phenomenon that only belongs to one insofar as one belongs to the principles of the universe, right? The opposition between mind and heart, right? And then these like more specific conceits that, and I'll just use the pun here, that fold themselves in and out in interesting ways. The idea of the difference between being revealed, as in the way that light reveals an object, and created. Now, to be revealed by light and created by light are two very different things. And both of those ways of seeing belong to the idea of form, but perhaps not to the specificity of what a shadow can mean to the forms that fall, right? And that's very, very interesting as well. And then again, First Beloved and Lady belong, perhaps, to Shakespearean tradition, but also, even prior to that, and as well as belonging certainly to, the metaphysical poets that appropriate, figures like this and utilize them as this sort of game or dance of organizing and structuring verse. She it is, Queen Under the Hill, and again, very, very sort of curious, like figuration with the all capitals, and relating to the naming of perhaps sacred beings, giving this figure, right, a nominalization, right, that refers to a position of her experience, right. Whose hosts are a disturbance of words within words, that is a field folded again. And so recognizing those differences in the way that and that Duncan plays with language, and what he's concerned with is interesting to me. And what I want to return to is and beginning with this idea of difference is a memory or a moment that I have not often been permitted to return to. And though I suggested that I've discussed it many times, and the reason that I don't allow myself to return to it is it's a very difficult moment, but I will attempt to return to it now, and I'll do so by just improvising around this memory, and with probably not much metaphysical conceit in place, and probably not with obvious stanza breaks or metaphors, but we'll see. So as if it were a scene made up by the mind, as if it were, because in a way, as memory, it becomes something from which it once was matter, and it was a matter of importance to me, and a matter of expectations, but as such is lost between the experience of the event and what I perhaps had intended the event to mean, and how I intended it to turn. It's not a field; it's a room, and I can't recall how we ended up there, but I can recall who we were, and I was who I am, and the person I was with was who he was, and he was David Anton, and I am who I am. And the reason we had ended up in this room, and it was a room it was a room in one of those terrible cement, the architecture, right? Wherefrom fall, only this architecture, as I know and recall, but reminds me of the architecture of Central Library at UCSD. But Muir College was made up of these horrible and cold and breezy, halls. There's a hall here somewhere, isn't there? And these concrete halls, and they were all gray. They didn't even paint them, and the exteriors were the only design the exteriors had was when they poured the concrete, and they had wooden molds, and these created designs and impressions on this gray concrete that was perpetually cold, no matter what the weather was, and which absorbed water in the rainy season to the best of its ability, and this architecture. I can't find the reference to the hall, but I know it's here somewhere. If one imagines this hill as a hall and these hosts as halled spirits dancing in the disturbance of words within words, maybe one can find it there. Oh, there's the hall. So that there is a hall therein that howls in rain and storm, and creates in such a howling hall an experience of the desire to retreat elsewhere, and it's odd that this is the college that was named after John Muir. Often I am permitted or not. I am not permitted to return to Muir College, the Hall of Howling Winds. But this is the scene that isn't made up in my mind, but is being remade, by my mind, as it were, because memory does strange things, and we guard against both the traumas and the vicissitudes of time, by recomposing that which is not ours into what belongs to us, and we make these places or remake them but not necessarily from what is generalizable, but from what is unintegratable in a certain sense, and that is how we make it our own, but it never really is mine, right? It belongs to a story that is older and than me, and that I'm not confined by, but can experience again in different ways, depending on how close I allow my heart to approach it. So there we are, and we're in one of these basement rooms, and it's so strange because what I remember in conversations with David prior to this were, well, he was the chair of the art department when I took independent classes in poetics from him, and I remember this very comfortable and warm room with a lot of volumes of books, and I had made an appointment to meet him in his office, and he claimed that he had been moved to this office in this hall, this cement hall, under the the cement architecture of these howling, the way that the wind howls through the hills, the breeze, these were like vortexes that this space created. And it was strange because, presumably UCSD, had enough money to hire, pretty sophisticated architects to build and design, these spaces. But why would they have designed them to, with these, to create these vortexes that were almost, unbearable, right? And as I said, cold and noisy, and certainly no place you wanted to be if you had an ear infection or or were suffering from some kind of illness. These spaces, folded into this made thing. And that lacked, in a certain way, the idea of field as it's described here, because one could only pass through these exterior halls, right, and with their cement parapets and walls and railings, in one of two directions. And so not only, one couldn't, move about, but one was, in a sense, trapped by this, linearity. And there were really no shadows either, because there wasn't much light that could make it into this particular architecture from above. So these the shadows didn't form forms or fall into forms, because there were no shadows, because all was shaded and cold. And so what was left out was the light, to do the creating. And it was very different, from this office that I had been invited, to share conversations with David in that space, right? And what I recall was that I had made an appointment, because I had asked David for a letter of recommendation, and he hadn't returned the letter, and my time was running out on the application deadlines that I had, and I wasn't aware that David harbored, some untold malice toward me at the time, and or that there was some, secret that he kept. And I had always received A's in all of his classes, and he had never complained about any of my work. And there was reason to believe, I had won, various kinds of awards for some of it. There was reason that I had to believe, I suppose, that he didn't harbor a secret, such as the game of Ring Around the Rosie, or Ring Around of Roses, told or remained untold. And so the placement of this office in this place of shadow or shade, I suppose, because not real shadows, because there was no light, and cold and concrete, surprised me. But what also surprised me was when I got there, he hadn't written the letter yet, and what I recall, and I may be wrong, but what I recall was an old-fashioned typewriter, and this would have been, early on in in the evolution of word processors, but certainly a word processor would have been possible. But that's not what I recall. I recall it being a typewriter, and I can't remember whether it was a manual typewriter or whether it was an electric typewriter. But I do recall that while I was there, he took out a piece of paper, and I remember that he had a lot of excuses for the absence of all of these tools and technologies, and I remember noting the strange placement of his office in this sort of concrete den. And I remember the disturbance of words within words as he typed out 1, 2, or perhaps 3 sentences, but no more than that. And this bizarrely misspelled letter, or letter filled with misspelled words or misspellings of words within misspelled words, and this very sort of backhanded series of compliments in the letters, that I had a quirky kind of intelligence, and I can't remember exactly what else, but no references to the massive amount of work that I actually I did at the time, and as anyone familiar with my YouTube page will realize that I continue to do today, right? So if you go to if you go to the YouTube page of say a band, the band will have between, I don't know what, say between a dozen and 200 videos of their performances of their music or their recordings of their music. I have nearly 1,500 videos that variously narrate and recite, and improvise and do all of these various things, and whether they do them well or not, they do a lot of work. So the fact that I had received what people refer to as decent marks suggested to me that that the work that I did do was acceptable. So I was really surprised by all of this, and then but what came as the greatest shock was that after it was all over, and I can't remember all of it, but I remember that perhaps it was that I was supposed to retype what he had already typed out, or I can't remember, but for some reason he did not place his recommendation into a letter and seal it with his signature, and suggested that I do this on my own, and then he gave this suggestion that the way to do it, to make it look like his signature, was to write it backwards. And I've talked about this before, but I haven't talked about that part of it, right? The disturbance of words within words, and the way that one's reality is can be destroyed in moments like this, in which the experience, the social experience of what your perception of belonging to a field, right, of interaction and engagement is suddenly replaced by a kind of like not the sun's going down, because that takes an hour, as Robert Duncan suggests here, but more like the slamming of a door, and one was so unaware that it was going to be slammed that one doesn't jump out of the way, and it strikes one, right? And the force of being hit with a door, and the door is not made of concrete, like the building or the hall, but it's a steel door, and it makes an enormous sound when it strikes you in the face, and it's like walking through a sliding glass door, if you've ever experienced that, and suddenly, like the reality that you knew in that space shatters along with the glass, and it's not an experience of comfortable dreaming, as in the Quonset or in the Return to the Field that Duncan is describing, but of a moment in which you realize that you never belonged. You never belonged to this social experience as you thought you might have. And perhaps you get a hint as to why you don't belong. And for me, this scene, as if it were made up by the mind, was one that I'd experienced many times as a child, and in different ways, but the same experience that one has, when one is identified, right, as being marginal for whatever reason, and the fact that the refusal, right, to write this letter of recommendation was made in these representational terms rather than just merely saying, no, I refuse to do this, but instead like performed in this like Grand Guignol sort of theater of cruelty and mockery and shaming, like you can't even write and write my name backwards, and I, of course, obviously I took it to relate to my experience as someone who has this difficulty in both writing and reading, and more than just both, because it's also in linear sequencing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in adding and subtracting. So what I've referred to as dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and in a certain sense dyslexia. And I no longer refer to it as dyslexia, because the way that I managed to overcome the reading element was by finding a way of recognizing words in terms of an overall shape, and what I call gestalt, as opposed to a series, linear sequence of letters. And so unless it's a word that I've never seen before, I can recognize it as a sight word, and it doesn't pose any problem. Now, in this poem of Robert Duncan's, I don't believe there are any words that I don't know, because it's basically written, and I don't know, it's basically written on a third grade level, right? Seen, mind, these are. None of these words are particularly difficult. I'm looking to see if where from is perhaps difficult construction for a child, but basically there's no vocabulary here, right? So I don't have any trouble reading a text like this, and I can demonstrate that as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place that is mine. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture, folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein, that is a made place, created by light, where from the shadows that our forms fall. And that's interesting, because when we read it this way, we notice that the first three stanzas are a single sentence, and then we notice that the next stanza is a sentence in and of itself, and the next stanza is a sentence of itself again, and then we have a sentence composed of two stanzas and two stanzas again. So although there's not a strictly speaking regular metrics, there are varying kinds of patterns, and there are patterns formed by numerical values of lines, right? Okay, so 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 3, 2. And let's see, is that symmetrical from top to bottom? I don't know. I haven't examined this before today, perhaps many years ago. Looks like it could be. So 2, 3, 2, 3, and then 2, and then 2, and then 3, and 3 again. Yeah, so it looks like it looks like it's symmetrical, right? In terms of the couplets and triplets. If you go from the top and then proceed from the top down and then proceed from the bottom up, unless I miss something, it looks like it's symmetrical in that respect. And then in terms of sentences, I believe it's asymmetrical. So you have 3 stanzas, and then on this last one you have 2 stanzas. You have 2 stanzas, and then you have 2 stanzas again, and here you have 3 stanzas, and then you have 1 stanza, and then you have 1 stanza again. And then from the bottom you have 2, 2, and 1, and 1. So yeah, so it's asymmetrical in terms of the number of stanzas it takes to complete a sentence, but it's symmetrical in terms of the number of lines that compose each stanza. So you have a play between symmetricality and asymmetricality based on this opposition between stanza line number and the number of stanzas that that constitute a sentence, right? And so there's a play, effectively between what constitutes a line, that is, a unit of measure before there's a break on the page, and what constitutes a sentence. And what's interesting about the way that Duncan does both of those things is that neither the line, well, the line breaks are more intuitive than the sentences are, right? The sentences, for the most part, are lengthy run-on sentences that could be broken up anywhere, as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place that is mind. Okay, now there you could put a period right there, right after that is mine period. It is so near to the heart, but you don't need to, and then you could put a period there if you wanted to after heart. So, but the lines themselves, have a natural kind of break to them, right? Given that, he's still like beholden to this notion of the breath line, right? And then that plays itself out thematically when the grass blows, right, back east from the source of light. I don't know if we want to, if the line is akin to the breath, and then is posed as the grass, and then that grass perhaps relates to Whitman, and Whitman's long lines is the light contrasted with that. And if so, does the light, in more ways than the line, represent the sentence or something else? And that, I don't know. But going back to the project, there was a wind blowing from the vortex, not because I remember it, but because it must have been, because that was the nature of the space, which was mine, having held it in mind and anticipated its date and time, but was not mine, and to which I did not belong, because the space was cold, because the space let in no light, because the space was a made place, but made with not much in mind, because it was a space far less near to the heart than I would have imagined, because not being mine, not being yours, it didn't belong to a pastoral eternal, or eternal pasture folded into the light of thought, but belonged to the space of a howling hall of winds and shade, that was a place, perhaps, that was no place, uncreated by light, where from the forms were all shadows fallen, always already, where from the architecture all falls I say, are likenesses of first fall, this named beloved, whose flowers were not flowers in flames, whose flames were not flowers lit to the lady, whose ladies were not likenesses of first beloved, whose architecture of howling winds was the only likeness. Lit, unflamed, unblossomed. First fomented, finally unfit. He it is in the hall whose hosts are a disturbance of winds and words within words, misspelling and fields unfolded into fiends. Blood and gold, and the first Hungarian queen is a man you remember from an unsigned book. In the halls of the blind, the one-eyed wind is king, queen, or some other word that means as sign or index pointing to a dream. The grass is neither green nor blowing. The east lies against the source of the sun. The sun is neither going down nor coming up. There is no sun, there is no east, there is no source against which the hour rests. There is no clay, there is gray, there is steel, there is a door that closes, there is a definition of such a door, there is a definition of such a door in words that belong to a children's game or the game played out in such a theater, such a space, whose secrets we cannot see but unfold, as if retelling the tale of a circle in which a ring around of roses could not be told in the innocence before a child. Never have I permitted myself to return to such a space, to such a basement, to such a typewriter where words were left unwritten, that any given property of the mind could be exposed to such boundaries that hold such chaos in transforming one's self as secret into darkness. A child's game that is a place of permission to ask for a word, a letter, a reminder, a remainder, perhaps everlasting omen of what is, what was, what could have been, what never had been, what might not have become. And we listen to the how, and we see the who and show, and we know these of now, and we listen as in what is and what isn't, of what and once and then.